Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Welcome to the Means of Grace podcast. I'm Jesse Ennis.
And I'm Kim Ingram, and we're with the leadership development team of the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. Thank you for joining us in this two-part episode where we are going to focus on intentional daily practices and periodic time away in order to strengthen our relationship with God. We are going to have conversations with several clergy and laity who will share with us about their individual practices in order that we might be able to think about how we can spend time learning more about our faith and growing in our relationship with God.
And now let's hear from Jeff Patterson as he guides us through Benedictine spirituality.
I'm Jeff Patterson. I'm the senior pastor of Wesley Memorial Church in High Point.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Can you share a bit of your experience in spiritual renewal?
For me, over the last several decades, spiritual renewal comes on a daily basis in my own private worship time, my private worship life, in my private worship space, my personal chapel, where I can go and reconnect with God and experience the presence of God in my life. And for me, it's part of a 40-year plus journey with Benedictine spirituality. My daily practice of connecting with God involves a lot with praying the daily office, the liturgy of the hours, praying through the Psalms daily, experiencing God in Lectio Divina, where I'm either speaking to God through the Scriptures or God speaking to me through the Scriptures. For me also, my connection to Benedictine spirituality, which began back in 1979 with Belmont Abbey Monastery and college, led me a little bit after that to become an oblate of the Order of St. Benedict. And an oblate is someone who's connected to a monastery, and even as a Protestant, you can become an oblate of the Order of St. Benedict and make a promise of your life to be offered through the use of Benedictine spirituality. And the monastic world, the cloistered monks there in Belmont taught me about the promises that we make as people rooted in Benedictine spirituality, promises to seek ongoing conversion, promises to seek stability, which for me is finding God in the moment, finding God where I'm at right now, not thinking I need to go somewhere else to look for God, but finding God where I'm at, and even finding God in the practice of submission. Learning to submit to God by submitting to people in my life, whether it's my bishop or my district superintendent or my family, but practicing that submission that allows me to really offer a more submitted life to God. So it's the daily practice of the disciplines, particularly those that I've learned through my connection with the Benedictine world, that keeps me spiritually renewed. And I can tell when I'm pretty obsessive about it. That structured world fits my personality, but I can tell if I move away from daily experiences of my spiritual practices, I can tell what it does to me personally. I can tell what it does to me in regards to my ministry, particularly in my relationships with other people. So it just keeps calling me back to my worship space. That's the whispering of God in my life, calling me back. Particularly morning prayer and evening prayer are very significant. It helps me to bracket my days in prayer. And just literally the visual side of my prayer book during the day calls me back to an awareness, the kind of the sacramental presence of God in my life.
Thank you so much for sharing that. What first got you interested in making this such a special time in your life?
Well, if you're talking about my connection with Benedictine spirituality, it was going to college at Belmont Abbey College. I was I was given a scholarship there to go there in 1979 to begin my college career. And I experienced a whole lot more than I realized when I became a student at Belmont Abbey College. I became pretty immersed in the religious life of the college there, because there is a Benedictine monastery there at the college. And so there I experienced both Benedictine spirituality and the Benedictine classical educational way that they promoted for centuries, and just staying connected to that. But also the daily practice of ministry keeps sending me back to the well from whence I can draw some living water. I learned really early in my ministry that working for God is no substitute for spending time with God. And I have to make that part of my day.
So how has your experience changed over time? How has your experiences in this type of spiritual renewal changed?
Part of the emphasis of Benedictine spirituality is a commitment to the practices. And you commit to those practices: daily prayer, lectio divina. I try to go back once a month to the monastery. Particularly early on, some of those practices just felt rather rote to me. But that's part of the wisdom of the tradition. Just do it whether you feel like it or not. And as you do it over time, you change. And over time, those practices become more and more a part of your life. So now that I've done it for several decades, it really is part of my life. There's still times it feels like I'm doing it just because it's morning and I've committed to this. But the longer I do it, the more precious and the sweeter those times feel in my life.
Amazing. So what does a practice of submission look like?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's been really easy for me as United Methodist, having a bishop telling me where I should serve, telling me where I should live. And I've lived in places and served in places in this annual conference that I never would have chosen myself. But, I've tried to always joyfully submit to the will of my bishop and the cabinet. For me, I have discovered that the itinerancy is a means of grace. My vow to go where sin is a means of grace. And I don't know that I've heard that articulated much in Methodist circles, but I heard it articulated in a roundabout way in Benedictine circles. That when I do things I don't necessarily want to do, it is helping me to practice submission to God. Because we all say we're ultimately submitted to God. That's what we want above all else, submission to God. But we can keep God rather distant at times. So, the Benedictine monks would frequently ask me, where am I practicing a life of submission? It's hard to say I'm submitted to God if I'm just have made a practice of always getting what I want out of every situation in life. So that's what the practicality of a vow or a promise of submission looks like to me. Because in the Benedictine tradition, it is very much submission to your ecclesiastical superior. For the Benedictine world, it is the abbot. For me, I have a bishop.
So what has been the most meaningful part of your experience?
It would be the daily time of prayer, time in reflective, transformative, devotional reading of Scripture, learning to listen for the voice, capital V, of God. It varies from day to day, but particularly the longer I stay committed to this lifestyle, the longer I try to live out my Benedictine promises, the more that I try to use Benedictinism, this 6th century rule of Benedictinism, the longer I've tried to allow this to be the trellis upon which my spiritual life can grow, just the sweeter it becomes. And it's not necessarily something I do, it's who I am at this point.
So if someone wanted to be introduced to a monastery, how do you make that first step?
I'm glad you asked. For about 12 years, I've been meeting a group of United Methodist clergy once a month at Belmont Abbey Monastery. We started 12 years ago, thought we were going to do it for 1 year. Now we're in year 12. We meet one Friday a month, and I'm offering this as an invitation. We meet one Friday a month, and we discuss a spiritual classic, either ancient or modern classic of Christian spirituality. And we finish our time that one day a month with joining the monks for midday prayer. And for some people, that has been their first step into that stream of Benedictine spirituality. For me, I started there, and that sort of keeps me grounded and keeps me returning to Belmont Abbey Monastery. But I've also experienced extremely fruitful times at Gethsemane Monastery, at St. Meinrad Monastery in Indiana. I know it sounds a little incongruous, but all the monasteries have wonderful websites now. And you can look them up, and most of them will go out of their way to provide retreat settings for clergy. I know at least one of our United Methodist bishops who goes annually to Gethsemane Monastery up in Kentucky. So the invitation to join me in our group at Belmont Abbey is there. But hopefully that's just an entrance into the world of Benedictine spirituality.
And is this opportunity only for clergy?
I would welcome anybody. Just if they want to contact me, I can help them plug in with us.
Now we're going to visit with Willis Greene and talk to her a little bit about her Sabbath keeping as part of her spiritual practices.
I'm Willis Greene, and I serve at First Methodist in Newton.
Willis, you and I have been good friends for a long time, and I have really admired how some of your spiritual practices and your commitment to Sabbath have really seen you through kind of day in and day out in your ministry. And I was wondering if you would talk to us a little bit more about that.
It really started around 2015. I'd always done some daily practices, but I wasn't very faithful with them. And I knew that Sabbath was important, and I would try to Sabbath was more like a day off rather than a spiritual discipline. And so in 2015, my husband David and I, who's also clergy, we attended a leadership conference in Queens, New York. And I thought we were just going to take a fun trip to New York. But it was at Pete Scazzero's church, and it was the Emotionally Healthy Leadership Conference. And as he sort of gave his personal testimony and his witness about how he had been so involved in ministry and so active, but he was reaching burnout. And as I listened to his story, it was sort of like listening to my own story. And he began to talk about the two practices that he was committed to, and they were Sabbath keeping and the daily office. And so Sabbath keeping I tuned into because I wanted to learn more about how to practice that in a more committed way. And so he gave 4 points to remember. And once I committed those to memory, then I could sort of follow that. And it was stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. And so now I had a framework to sort of envision what a Sabbath would look like. For me, Sabbath is really surrendering, and it's giving up this 24-hour period of have-tos and anxiety. And Scazzero talked about it as if it was a snow day. And I am all about snow days. I'm all about snow days. I have been about snow days since I was a kid. I mean, just waiting for that morning call, that school was canceled. Because what do you do on a snow day? Nothing. You just have fun and you just enjoy the day. And I even get excited when it's a snow day now, and which is sort of silly because we can still work with our computers and the internet and everything that we have at our fingertips. But there's something about a day when you don't have to do anything. And so back to the 4 points about stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. To stop means to literally stop working. And that means not only our office work and our church work, but also work at home. So you'll find me on Thursday night at Sabbath. We attempt Sabbath from 9 p.m. on Thursday to 9 p.m. on Friday. And so you'll see me on Thursday night doing all the last-minute things around the house that I need to do. One last load of laundry, paying a final bill, just whatever I have to do to sort of clear that day from 9 p.m. Thursday to 9 p.m. Friday. So that's stop, to stop work. And then to rest is simply that, to rest. Just as God did in creation, to really be at ease and to rest. And when we first started practicing Sabbath, I'm not a big napper because to me, I'm always thinking about the next thing that I need to do. But there is something about physical rest. And so those first few Sabbaths, I would take a nap. Like I would get up in the morning and after exercising and after reading a little bit, I would take a nap. And I know that sounds really sort of somewhat silly almost, but it is an amazing feeling to wake up from a nap and be rested, to rest when one is not necessarily tired. And that was a novel concept for me. And when I woke up from those naps, that I went to sleep and I wasn't tired, and then to wake up fully rested, it is a different type of being at rest. And I remember the first time waking up thinking, this is what that we're supposed to feel like, is this rested physical presence. And then to delight is to find something that I delight in. Now, usually this is something with David, and we partner together to think of what we're going to do that day that will bring us delight. And we do different things. When the weather's good, sometimes we've hiked at Mount Mitchell. We'll go and explore Black Mountain. It's close to us. But then sometimes we'll see a movie. But whatever it is that we enjoy together. And sometimes that's watching TV, but we try not to do a lot of that. But if it's a funny show and something that we delight in, we'll do that. And then C is contemplation. I sort of have this acronym for it, this SRDC, but C is contemplation, and that's the daily quiet time that I have with God. And sometimes it's more extended on Sabbaths because I have more time and I don't feel quite as constricted. But it maybe it could mean taking a longer time for meditation, where usually I meditate for 10 to 30 minutes. Sometimes I'll just do an hour on Sabbath because I know that I don't have anything that I'm committed to doing. So once I sort of had that framework of stop, rest, delight, and contemplate, I could work with that. Sabbath for me is not about legalism. It's not about keeping these rules because that defeats the purpose of it. If it is to be this day of rest and enjoyment, if I set too many parameters around it, it just defeats the purpose of what Sabbath should be. And that happened to me last weekend. I had a church member that landed in the hospital at Baptist, and so that's about an hour drive for me. And I didn't panic that, oh my goodness, this is going to be work, and now I have to make this hospital visit. But instead, I invited David to go with me, and then we spent some time in Winston visiting some places that we hadn't visited in a while. And so we made that fun. So because as pastors, our job is 24/7. I mean, we're on call 24/7, even when we set aside times. And so we work around it, but we don't let it monopolize. When we get called out on a Friday, we don't let it completely monopolize that day. So that's how we spend Sabbath together.
Do you ever change the day of the week because something happens on a Friday that you really get scheduled that you have no control over? Do you ever swap it out for another day, or do you just do the best you can with what you have and then you do better the next time?
We'll swap it out. It's interesting. When we do swap it out, it doesn't feel the same. Like it's like we're off rhythm. And to me, that is part of the spiritual disciplines, is that they create a rhythm in your life, in my life. And so it can be the daily rhythm of time with God in the morning and in the evening. But then that day, on Thursday, Friday. So yes, we'll swap it out, but it's usually not a full 24-hour period. Like we end up cutting it short somewhere. But that's a good question. Yeah.
So I wonder about your practice of the daily office. I know that many people and people we've spoken to for this podcast talk about a space at their house that they've set aside. You have space at the church, and I wonder if you would just talk about how you identified that space and how you utilize it.
Mm-hmm. So the pastor's office is down on the first level where there is a lot of traffic. It's across from the administrative office, and so people are always sort of popping their head in, and even when the door's closed, they'll knock, and so it's sort of being fully accessible. And I remember I had a professor one time, Fred Craddock, he said, pastors do not need to be a mass of availability. And when we place our office space right in the corridor of a lot of traffic, we become a mass of availability. And so I knew that I had to find a different physical space. So up in our education building, there were a couple empty classrooms, and I claimed that as an office study space. And when I go up there, people really respect that time where I've separated myself from the flow of traffic. So I'll use that as a study space, a space to be with God, but I also have one at home as well that I use in the morning before I go into the office. Yeah.
And my experience has been that these practices have really centered you and helped you in some challenging times of ministry not get so kind of caught up in whatever is going on. And I wonder if you could just talk about that.
When I'm in those times, in placing myself fully in the presence of God. We're always in the presence of God, but there's times when we set aside and it becomes more apparent, more aware. I'm reminded that it is not about me, and that there is this larger narrative of which I am a part, and this rhythm of God's world that I am a small part of. And that God's Spirit flows through me to be in ministry with others rather than me trying to control everything that's going on in my life. And so when I hit challenging times, when I'm quiet with God, God reminds me that it's not about me, and that I'm part of this larger story, and that if I will be still and allow God's Spirit to work through me and flow through me, then I'll sort of be guided through it. Yeah.
So you referenced going to New York City and meeting and hearing from Pete Cesaro. And for people who might not have that opportunity, how else can they become familiar with Pete Cesaro's kind of work?
So the first book that we were introduced to was The Emotionally Healthy Church. And we were seeking that out, simply help with staff issues that had come up. And then from the Emotionally Healthy Church, we discovered the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And it's produced by Zondervan. There's a small group curriculum with it. It has been updated over the years, and I would recommend it. And then later, I actually taught the course in the congregation. But I'm sure if you Googled Cesaro, the website comes up. Yeah.
Our next guest is Joseph Kim. Joseph has been training as a spiritual director and has practiced spiritual direction. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the spiritual practice of spiritual direction in our conversation today.
Hi, I'm Joseph Kim. I'm serving at Lee's Chapel and Caraway in Greensboro. I have a 2-point charge, so that's why I'm serving.
We're glad to have you with us today in this conversation. I know that the Northern Piedmont District has had an emphasis in spiritual direction and has been training some of the clergy or been having them trained in spiritual direction and that you've participated in that. I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little bit about what spiritual direction is for people maybe not familiar with it.
For me, spiritual direction is realignment. The reason why I say realignment is because we have lots of information about the Bible and theology in our head, and then we have a great passion in our heart to do the right thing for God and as the disciple of Jesus. But they do not necessarily align well with where we are headed on our feet. So there's a misalignment among head, heart, and feet. So because of that, we need to do spiritual direction so that we can have this alignment among these three components. Romans 10:15 says, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." So unless you have this alignment among these three components, you cannot really be sure that you are the disciples of Jesus in the right meaning. And also for me, spiritual direction is rediscovery of dialogue. Many times people think they are in dialogue, which is a conversation among two people or more people. But rather than doing dialogue, they do monologue because they are interested in what they are thinking about in their hearts rather than truly engaging in the conversation with the other party in this conversation. Proverbs 27:19 says, "As the water reflects the face, your life reflects your heart." In other words, your saying and your act reflect what you have in your heart. So when you meet with somebody that triggers you about what you're interested in or what you are afraid of, you tend to pick it up and you fall into monologue. So one example, when I was at Emory Hospital as a chaplain, I had a good friend who was a PA, and every now and then we bump into each other on the floor. And then whenever he met with me, he made a comment on my tie, and he said, "Oh, you have a wonderful tie, it's so pretty," and kind of stuff. And I was thinking, "Oh, finally you know that, I have a great sense of fashion." The next time he met me on the floor, he mentioned again on my tie, "Oh my gosh, you have a luxurious tie this time. Where did you buy that?" And then over and over again, he commented on my tie. And then finally, to the point that I got curious about his tie. So I looked at his tie. His tie looked way more luxurious, way more colorful. So I commented on that. "Gosh, you have a way more beautiful tie than mine. Where did you buy that?" And then he started talking about a tie for the next 30 minutes on the floor, standing. And then the truth was he had a big collection of ties in his house. So in one room in his house, on the whole side of one room, there's a rack of ties, the tie collection. So, and then he was pretty much doing monologue because he found something that interested his heart. So many times we fall into monologue instead of doing dialogue. And then unless you're really truly spiritually aware or awakened, you can do this kind of mistakes in your ministry with others. So that's another reason why we do spiritual direction. So for me, I think spiritual direction is realignment among head, heart, and feet, and the rediscovery of true dialogue.
So thank you for that. For people who might not be familiar with even what it feels like or looks like to meet with a spiritual director, you've introduced us to the idea that it is a conversation. Can you tell us a little bit more about what someone might expect if they went and sat down in a room with a spiritual director?
So when you meet with a spiritual director, and they would check on with you about how you are doing in terms of your spirit. So they would ask you like, "Oh, how have you come?" or "How have you arrived in your spirit?" And then starting with that, they would help you to check on about your spiritual health. And then as they help you to reflect on what has happened in your life and then how you have handled that spiritually. And they would help you to reflect on it and trying to find how you can realign among head, heart, and feet, and then rediscover how much is your story and how much is God's story and how much is the stories of those who participate in your ministry.
Yeah, so I think sometimes spiritual direction can feel intimidating, but you've made it seem really invitational. It really is a conversation, and it kind of goes, I think, in the directions that the person needs or wants for it to go, kind of in that space at the direction of the spiritual director.
Exactly.
So, who might benefit from meeting with a spiritual director, or how would somebody benefit from that in their ministry or in their life?
Usually I have had requests for a spiritual direction from those who feel out of alignment among those three components, like I said, among head, heart, and feet. And whenever they feel harder to tell God's guidance and God's words in their spiritual reflection, usually that's the time when I get the request from those. And they will get great benefit from spiritual direction. But I believe that all ministers, whether they're lay ministers or clergies or any type of spiritual leaders, the Christian leaders on the floor, they should have spiritual direction regularly rather than requesting spiritual direction when there's a need.
How often might somebody meet with a spiritual director?
For me, I have met with my own spiritual director once a month, and I have given spiritual direction to my spiritual directee once a month regularly. But on top of that, I personally have met with my spiritual companion, and then we call each other spiritual director. We're more like a spiritual companion. So we have enjoyed this conversation and co-directing.
And so I wonder what caused you to want to be trained as a spiritual director?
I have gone to different kinds of schools and different levels of schools for different degrees of schools. And I felt like I have been in school for all my life. And this I have been told. And that's the way I've been teased by my wife and friends. But the place where I felt most growing up was where I got the spiritual direction through clinical pastoral education. Many people see that as a clinical training, but for me, I saw that and I experienced that as a form of spiritual direction in group setting. So, and I have practiced this in my spiritual direction, and I have been serving as one of the small group leaders at the spiritual direction school and also neighborhood seminary. And I taught spiritual direction in group setting, and people have commented about their positive experience about this type of spiritual direction, which is spiritual direction in group setting. When a person shares their life story in this group setting, the peers put the mirrors back on to this speaker. And in that way, they can hear somehow what God is telling them in this spiritual direction. It has been interesting and very meaningful and significant way of doing spiritual direction for me. And I have learned a lot in this setting.
And Joseph, this podcast is really about spiritual renewal, spiritual practices. And I wonder if there's anything that you would like to add just about your own spiritual practices that you think others could have an entry point into something that maybe has been meaningful for you.
For me, I think, like I said at the beginning, I hope that people will not see spiritual direction as head-related activity only. For me, it's really have to do with three different components altogether, like head, heart, and feet. So if I could give them my advice, I would try to recommend them to find their own unique way of spiritual direction. For me, it's fishing. Yeah, so I go fishing to do a spiritual direction. So when I cast, I do not necessarily cast to catch fish. And when I cast, it really helps me to get rid of all this trifle ideas and anxiety and worries of my life or my ministries, and I could focus on listening to what God tries to tell me, so that I could focus on a rediscovery of true dialogue and not falling into my monologue. So I think I believe that each and every Christian does have their own unique way of doing spiritual direction. They just do not know yet. And one of the goals of the spiritual director for them would be to help them find that out, what they have been doing, but they have not been aware of.
Wow, that's great. Thank you so much, Joseph, for sharing with us some of your practices and wisdom and insight. Thank you. Thanks to our guests for continuing this conversation with us. And for a short time, there are scholarships available for clergy and ministry professionals to participate in spiritual renewal or take time away. More information is available in the show notes.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you've enjoyed listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. That's WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Gojo Studios.